I have to keep going. Almost there. Just a little further.
It was 14 degrees in Gray Fall, Washington, and the snow was falling sideways. Not the soft, quiet kind of snow that settles on window ledges and makes the world look peaceful. This was the kind that cut, sharp and wet and relentless, driving in off the Cascades like the mountains themselves had decided to punish everything below. The kind of snow that gets inside your collar and finds the back of your neck and reminds you in no uncertain terms that nature does not care whether you live or die. Ethan Cross was 15 years old and he was dying in it. He moved along the back side of Ironwood Avenue in a half-run, half-stumble, his left eye swollen, nearly shut, his lower lip split and caked with blood that had dried brown against his chin. His Converse sneakers, held together at the toe with 2 strips of silver duct tape, had soaked through 40 minutes ago. He could no longer feel his feet. His flannel shirt, thin as paper and missing 2 buttons, was plastered flat against his ribs by the wind. He had no coat. He had left without a coat because there had been no time, and because the coat in his room at the Riggs house had a broken zipper and smelled like mildew anyway, and because none of that mattered now. What mattered was that Roy Stokes was not behind him. Not yet. Ethan stopped at the corner of a chain-link fence and pressed his back against the corrugated steel wall of an abandoned machine shop. He stood very still. He listened past the wind, past the rattle of a loose gutter overhead, past the distant bark of someone's dog 2 streets over. He listened for the sound of boots on pavement, for the creak of a truck door, for the particular growl of Officer Cal Decker's patrol car engine, which he had memorized over the past 7 weeks, the way a prisoner memorizes the sound of the guard's footsteps. Nothing. He breathed out, and his breath fogged thick and white in front of his face. He pressed one hand flat against his ribs, feeling the hard rectangular shape through the thin fabric of his shirt. The phone was still there, tucked inside a folded insole fitted into the toe box of his left sneaker. It was a battered LG flip phone, 3 years out of date, with a cracked inner screen and a back panel held on by a rubber band. He had found it in the recycling bin behind the Oak Street convenience store on a Tuesday afternoon 7 weeks ago. On the 1 hour per week, Dolores Riggs allowed her foster kids to walk to the library. He had not walked to the library. He had walked to the alley behind the convenience store, found the phone, tucked it inside his waistband, and walked back before anyone noticed. That phone was the only reason Ethan was still moving forward instead of lying down in the snow and letting his body make the decision for him. But first he had to survive the night. He pushed off the wall and kept moving. 7 weeks earlier, Ethan Cross had arrived in Gray Fall with a single black garbage bag containing everything he owned. A change of jeans, 3 t-shirts, a paperback copy of a Louis L'Amour novel with the cover torn off that his mother had left on the kitchen table, which he had taken because it felt wrong to leave it. A toothbrush, half a tube of toothpaste, 1 photograph folded in quarters of himself at age 9, standing in front of a Christmas tree with his mother, both of them squinting because the flash had been too bright. His mother, Sandra Cross, had left on a Tuesday in early October. She had driven away in her 1999 Pontiac Grand Am with the cracked rear bumper, and she had left a note on a Burger King napkin on the kitchen counter. The note said 3 things. It said she was sorry, it said she loved him, it said she could not do this anymore. Ethan had read the note 4 times standing in the kitchen in his socks. Then he had folded it and put it in the pocket of his jeans. Then he had gone to school because he did not know what else to do. By Thursday, the school had contacted the county. By Friday afternoon, a woman from Child Protective Services named Judith Boone had arrived at the apartment with a manila folder, a practiced, sympathetic expression, and the efficient energy of someone who processes paperwork for a living and has learned not to make eye contact too long. She had driven Ethan to the Riggs property on the south edge of Gray Fall without much conversation. The house sat at the end of a half-mile gravel driveway, surrounded by dead fir trees and old farm equipment rusting in the weeds. It was a large house once. You could see that it had been large and perhaps even handsome in the way that farmhouses in the Pacific Northwest can be handsome, all dark wood and steep roof lines. But that was a long time ago. Now the porch sagged. 3 of the front windows had been replaced with plywood. The gutters along the north side of the roof had separated entirely and hung at an angle like a broken arm. Dolores Riggs met them at the door. She was a heavy-set woman in her middle 50s with iron gray hair pulled back tight and small, watchful eyes that moved over Ethan the way a merchant moves over inventory. She smiled at Judith Boone. It was a practiced smile, warm at the surface and completely empty underneath, the kind of smile that exists only to be remembered later by people filling out forms. She did not smile at Ethan. She showed him his room. It was on the second floor, the last door on the left. There was a cot with a thin foam mattress and a blanket that had been washed so many times it had lost any identifiable color. There was a single overhead bulb on a pull chain. There was a window, but the lower pane had been cracked and repaired with a strip of duct tape that had begun to peel at one corner, letting in a thin, cold whistle of outside air. There were four other kids in the house. He met them at dinner, which was canned soup ladled into bowls at a table where no one spoke. The pantry was padlocked. Ethan noticed it the first night, a heavy brass padlock on a hasp screwed into the pantry door frame. The refrigerator had a combination lock threaded through the handle. Food appeared twice a day, measured out by Dolores herself, and it was never quite enough. Not starving, just always a little short. Just enough that by 9 o'clock at night, your stomach was a hollow, aching thing you tried to sleep through. The thermostat in the hallway was set to 50 degrees and covered with a small plastic box that required a key to open. Roy Stokes arrived each morning at 7 and left each night at 9. He was Dolores's hired hand, officially listed on the state paperwork as a facilities manager, which was a title that required no certification and carried no oversight. He was 43 years old, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped hair, and the particular stillness of a man who has discovered that the threat of violence is often more efficient than violence itself. He carried a thick leather belt looped through his jeans, and he had a habit of pulling it through the loop slowly when one of the kids did something that displeased him. Sometimes that was enough, sometimes it was not. On Ethan's third night, Roy used the belt on a 12-year-old boy named Marcus for dropping a bowl of soup. Ethan lay in his cot on the second floor and listened to the sound of it through the floorboards and said nothing, because he was new and did not yet understand the full geography of the danger he was inside. By the end of the first week, he understood. The state of Washington allocated $940 per month per child to licensed foster caregivers. Dolores Riggs had 5 children in her home. That was $4,700 per month, moving from state coffers into Dolores Riggs's bank account. By law, a substantial portion of that money was required to be spent on the children's food, clothing, housing, and medical care. Ethan was a quiet boy, but he was not a slow one. He had always been good with numbers. He had always noticed things. Within 2 weeks, he had constructed a reasonably accurate accounting of the household in his head, the way a person marooned on an island takes inventory of what they have and what they need. He noted the gap between what the state was sending and what the children were receiving. He noted the new television in Dolores's bedroom. He noted the online gambling sites open on her laptop on the kitchen table on Saturday mornings. He noted Roy Stokes's new work boots. He noted all of it and said nothing, because saying something to the wrong person was the most dangerous thing a kid in his position could do. He had learned this on a Wednesday in his third week, the first time Judith Boone came for her monthly welfare check. Judith Boone arrived at 2 in the afternoon in a gray Honda Civic with a county seal on the door. She came inside with her clipboard and her manila folder and her practiced sympathetic expression. Dolores walked her through the house with the particular ease of a woman who has rehearsed this tour many times. Clean counters, made beds, a bowl of fruit on the kitchen table that Ethan had never seen before and would not see again after Judith's car left the driveway. Ethan stood in the hallway with Marcus and the other kids and watched. At the door, as Judith was leaving, Dolores stepped onto the porch and pulled the door nearly closed behind her. Not all the way, just enough to suggest privacy without achieving it. Ethan stood 2 feet from the door and heard everything. The sound of a paper envelope changing hands. The scratch of a pen on a form. Judith Boone's voice professionally warm. "Everything looks great, Dolores. See you next month." The door opened. Judith walked past Ethan without meeting his eyes. He watched her drive away down the gravel road. He stood there for a long time after her taillights disappeared. That was the moment Ethan Cross stopped waiting to be saved. He had understood, in the abstract, that the system was imperfect. Children understand this the way they understand all large, uncomfortable truths about the world at a distance, theoretically, as something that happens to other people. But standing in that hallway, hearing the rustle of that envelope, watching that car drive away, Ethan Cross understood it personally and completely. No one was coming, not Judith Boone, not the county, not the careful bureaucratic machinery of the state of Washington, which had delivered him to this house and would continue month after month to fund it. If anything was going to change, he was going to have to change it himself. He started planning that same afternoon. The LG flip phone took him 11 days to get working. The screen was cracked but functional. The battery held a charge for about 4 hours. He could not use it in the house because Dolores conducted random searches of the kids' rooms twice a week, running her hands under mattresses and along window ledges with the efficient thoroughness of someone who has found contraband before and intends to find it again. He kept the phone in a Ziploc bag inside a hollowed-out cavity he had pressed into the foam of his spare insole stored at the bottom of his garbage bag of belongings under the cot. He charged it during the single hour per week when Dolores allowed the kids to walk to the public library 4 blocks away. The library had an outlet behind the periodical shelf that no one used. He would plug the phone in, sit with a book open on his lap, and watch the battery indicator climb. The Wi-Fi password at the library was printed on a laminated card at the front desk. The coffee shop, 2 doors down from the library, had its Wi-Fi network name visible on a chalkboard sign through the glass. He had watched a man at an outdoor table type in the password one afternoon. He had a good memory for things of characters, always had. The Wi-Fi from the coffee shop reached as far as the alley behind the dry cleaner on the next block if you stood at the north end of the alley and held the phone at head height. He discovered this on his 4th week. He began going to the library on Tuesday afternoons and spending his hour walking a loop that brought him through that alley for 12 minutes before returning to the Riggs house on schedule. In those 12 minutes, he uploaded photographs. He had been taking photographs for 3 weeks before he uploaded the first one. He was methodical about it. He photographed the padlock on the pantry door from 3 angles. He photographed the combination lock on the refrigerator. He photographed the thermostat enclosure with its key lock. He photographed the condensation on the inside of the broken window in Marcus's room. He photographed his own left forearm where Roy's belt had caught him across the wrist, the bruise still vivid yellow and purple at 5 days old. And photographed Judith Boone's gray Honda Civic in the driveway during her second visit, getting the license plate clearly in frame. He could not photograph the envelope exchange directly, but he stood near the door and recorded the audio on the phone's voice memo app. The quality poor, but the voices distinguishable, the transaction unmistakable to anyone listening with intention. He photographed Roy Stokes's truck in the driveway every morning. Plate number, date, timestamp. He wrote nothing down on paper. Everything was on the phone. He had 41 photographs and 7 audio recordings by the end of week 6. He did not know exactly who he would give them to or when or how. He knew only he was building something, a case, a record, proof that what was happening in the Riggs house on the south edge of Grayfall was not invisible and not without witnesses. He was the witness. The night he ran, it was not planned. He had intended to wait. He had a rough outline in his head, still forming, of how to get his evidence to someone who could act on it. He was working on it. He was 15 years old and working on it alone, and he needed more time. Roy Stokes did not give him more time. It was a Thursday night in mid-November, the temperature already down to 18 degrees outside and 52 degrees inside the house. Ethan had taken half a bread roll from the kitchen after dinner and broken it into 2 pieces and given 1 piece to Rosie, the youngest child in the house. Rosie was 7 years old and small for her age, with pale blonde hair and a way of looking at things sideways, like she had learned that direct eye contact sometimes caused problems. She had been at the Riggs house for 4 months. She had arrived weighing 41 pounds. Roy caught Ethan into the hallway with the bread. What followed was not the worst thing Roy Stokes had done in that house. It was not even close to the worst thing. But it was the thing that happened on this particular night, and it was enough. The belt caught Ethan across the left side of his jaw on the backswing, an unintentional precision that sent a white flash across his vision and dropped him against the wall. He slid down to the floor and sat there for a moment with his ears ringing and his vision tunneling at the edges. He heard Dolores somewhere behind Roy saying nothing. He lay in his cot that night and waited. He listened to the house settle into the particular quality of silence that means the adults have stopped moving. He waited another 40 minutes past that point. Then he dressed in the dark, the way he had practiced dressing in the dark, so that he would not have to turn on the overhead bulb and risk the light showing under the door. Flannel shirt, jeans, both pairs of socks. The Converse with the duct tape at the toe, the phone in its folded insole inside the left shoe. No coat. He went out through the window on the ground floor bathroom, the cracked one he had been working the latch on for 2 weeks slowly, half a turn at a time, until it moved freely. He lowered himself into the snow and ran. He had been running for 40 minutes when the cold became something different. Not uncomfortable, not painful, just absent. When cold stops hurting, you are in trouble. He understood this from something he had read once in a science class or a book, he could not remember which. The fact had lodged in his memory as a curiosity, an interesting thing about the human body, the kind of detail that seems abstract until you are living inside it. His shivering had stopped 10 minutes ago. He knew what that meant. He turned down Ironwood Avenue because there was light at the far end of it, a yellow spill coming from under a half-raised steel garage door. And light means heat, and heat was the only thing that mattered now. He made it to the edge of the driveway before his knees buckled. The compound at the end of Ironwood Avenue was not a place the people of Greyfall looked at directly. You looked near it. You looked at the stretch of chain link fence with the razor wire along the top, and then you moved your eyes in a different direction, the way you move your eyes away from a fire that is too bright. The building itself was a converted industrial garage cinder block and corrugated steel with reinforced bay doors and a security camera mounted above the entrance that tracked with visible deliberateness. The motorcycles parked along the inside wall were the kind that cost more than most people in Greyfall made in a year. Long, heavy machines with custom tank paint and chrome exhaust pipes that caught the light like something polished in a museum. 3 of them were visible from the driveway, gleaming under fluorescent lights. The man standing next to the red Snap-on toolbox was built like he had been doing hard physical work his entire life and had never stopped. He was 6 feet 4 inches tall with a graying beard that reached the collar of his flannel shirt and forearms that carried the particular density of muscle earned over decades rather than years. His leather vest was open over the flannel, and across the back of it in curved letters of crimson and gold were the words that every person in Greyfall had been raised to give a wide berth. Boone Mercer had been a Hell's Angel for 22 years. He heard the sound at the edge of the driveway at 12 minutes past 2 in the morning. A soft, wet impact on frozen asphalt, the sound of something that was trying to stay upright and had just lost the argument. He set down the socket wrench in his hand and picked up the mag light from the top of the toolbox and walked toward the open bay door. The boy on the driveway was on his hands and knees. His head was down and his arms were shaking with a tremor that was not voluntary, the deep muscular shaking of a body trying to generate heat by force. He was wearing a flannel shirt and jeans that had soaked through completely. His sneakers were held together at the toe by duct tape. His left eye was swollen shut. There was dried blood along his jaw, and his lower lip had split and re-swollen in the cold. Boone Mercer had seen violence. He had been present at its delivery on more than one occasion and had been on the receiving end of it on several others. He was not a man easily moved by the sight of physical damage, but there was something about the boy on his driveway that was not simply physical damage. There was something in the angle of his shoulders, in the way he was keeping his head down even now. Even here at the end of a road, he had clearly run to, out of pure desperation. The posture of someone who has been taught slowly and thoroughly that raising your head is a risk you have to calculate before taking. Boone put the flashlight beam on the boy's face. The boy looked up. Boone Mercer went very still. On the inside of the boy's left wrist, just below the cuff of his flannel shirt, was a small tattoo. Crude and imprecise, the kind of tattoo made with a sewing needle and the ink from a ballpoint pen. It was a small bird, a penguin, though you had to look at it twice to be sure because the lines were uneven and the proportions slightly wrong, in the way of something made by someone who was young and working without a mirror and entirely by feel. Boone Mercer looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at his own right wrist where the same bird had lived for 35 years. Same uneven lines, same slightly wrong proportions, same needle and ballpoint origin. He looked from his wrist to the boy's wrist and back again. He said nothing. He stepped to one side and jerked his head toward the inside of the garage. Get in here. His voice was gravel and concrete and complete authority. Before I have to dig a hole for your frozen corpse. Ethan crossed the threshold of the garage, and the heat hit him like a physical thing. The large cast iron stove in the corner was throwing waves of it, and the change in temperature from the air outside was so abrupt that his legs went completely, and he went down onto the concrete floor and could not get back up. He curled on his side and his teeth started chattering again, which was good, he thought dimly. Shivering again meant the body was still fighting. He heard the bay door rattle shut behind him. He heard the big man's voice calling two names, Wade, Duke, get out here. Two more men came through a steel door at the back of the shop. The first was lean and weathered with a deeply scarred jaw and the careful, deliberate movement of someone who has had serious injuries and learned to accommodate them. This was Wade Flynn Boone's sergeant-at-arms and the man he trusted most in the chapter, a relationship built over 17 years on the road and in places considerably less comfortable than a garage in November. Wade walked out wiping his hands on a shop rag, took one look at the boy on the floor and said nothing, which was somehow more reassuring than any question would have been. The second man was Wade's younger brother, broader with a thick neck and the kind of calm that reads on some men as menace and on others as bedrock reliability. Duke Flynn looked at Ethan on the floor and then looked at Boone. Boone had already moved to the metal locker against the far wall. He came back with a fleece-lined flannel hoodie and dropped it onto Ethan. Space heater from the office, he said to Wade. Duke the steak from the clubhouse. Warm it up. Fast. Neither man asked why. In their world, when Boone Mercer gave an order, you moved. Within 8 minutes, Ethan was sitting on a wooden crate next to the iron stove buried inside Boone's oversized hoodie, with a paper plate of reheated steak and mashed potatoes in his hands and a mug of heavily sugared black coffee steaming beside him. He ate the way a person eats who has been chronically underfed for 7 weeks quickly and without looking up, using his fingers because the fork was too slow. Slow down, Duke said quietly from across the shop, or you will be sick all over my floor. Ethan slowed down. Boone pulled a rolling stool close and sat. He lit a cigarette and looked at the boy in his hoodie eating in silence for a while. He was a man who understood the value of letting people finish before you start asking. When the plate was clean and the coffee was half gone, he leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at Ethan directly. Tell me your name. Ethan Cross. How old are you, Ethan Cross? 15. Boone's eyes moved to Ethan's swollen face, then to his wrist, then back up. Who put that on your face? A man named Roy Stokes. He works for my foster mother. Her name is Dolores Riggs. They live on County Road 7. Something changed in the quality of air inside the garage. Wade stopped moving. Duke crossed his arms. Boone took a long drag of the cigarette and exhaled slowly through his nose. Ethan continued. He told them everything. He told them about the padlock pantry and the combination lock on the refrigerator and the thermostat in the plastic box. He told them about Roy Stokes and the belt. He told them about Judith Boone arriving on Wednesday afternoons with her clipboard and manila folder and the envelope she took at the door on the way out. He told them about Officer Cal Decker and the $200 per runaway. When he said Decker's name, Wade Flynn made a sound that was not quite a word. I have proof, Ethan said. He reached into his left sneaker and removed the insole and unfolded it and held out the LG flip phone to Boone Mercer. Boone took it. He looked at it for a moment. Then he opened it and began scrolling through what was on it. Slowly, the way you read something you need to understand completely before you respond to it. He scrolled for a long time. His face did not change expression, but something behind his eyes grew dark and deliberate in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with decision. He handed the phone to Wade without a word. How long, Boone said. 7 weeks. Boone stood up and walked to the workbench. He crushed the cigarette into an ashtray and stood with his back to the room for a moment. Ethan watched the muscles across his shoulders settle into something that was not stillness, but the thing that exists just before action. Then the red and blue lights came through the frosted panel windows of the bay door. Ethan was on his feet before he knew he was standing. The old automatic response, the reflex that 7 weeks had burned into his brainstem. His eyes went to the door. He took 2 steps back toward the stove. That is Decker. His voice came out thin. He tracked me here. He is going to take me back. Boone turned around. His voice was flat and absolute and left no room for anything else. Nobody is taking you anywhere. Outside, a fist hit the steel bay door hard enough to boom through the shop. Cassidy, the voice was nasal and thick with the arrogance of authority that has never been seriously challenged. Roll it up, Boone. I am tracking a runaway stolen property complaint spotted on your street. Open the door. Wade looked at Boone. Boone's hand moved to the cell phone in his vest pocket. He dialed. One ring. A deep voice answered. Yeah, Vance, Boone said quietly. Wake the boys. We got a situation down at the shop. Decker is at my door over a foster kid we pulled out of the ice. You need to hear what this boy has on his phone. It is about to get ugly. There was a pause. Then 10 minutes, brother. Hold the line. Boone put the phone away. He turned to Ethan, and for the first time since the boy had come through the door, something moved across a Boone Mercer's face that was not professionally neutral. Not quite a smile, but the expression of a man who has drawn a line in a particular place and is completely at peace with what it will cost him. Relax, kid. Outside, Decker's fist hit the door again. You got to 3, Boone said to nobody in particular, and turned back to his workbench. You are going to find out what happens when you knock on the wrong door. Ethan Cross pulled the oversized hoodie tighter around his shoulders and sat back down on the crate next to the stove. His feet were beginning to hurt again. That it was good. That meant the feeling was coming back. He pressed his right hand against his left wrist against the small, uneven bird that lived there. He did not know yet what it meant to Boone Mercer, but he was about to find out. Outside in the freezing dark, the first sound reached Ironwood Avenue before the lights did. Low and distant, and synchronized a vibration that moved through the asphalt and up through the concrete floor of the garage and into the soles of Ethan's ruined sneakers. Not a siren, not a single engine. Many engines, growing. The sound arrived before the light did. It started as a low-frequency tremor, the kind you feel in your back teeth before your ears register it as sound. Ethan felt it come up through the concrete floor and into the wooden crate beneath him and into his spine. He had spent 7 weeks in a house where every sound meant something, where footsteps on the stairs at the wrong hour meant you needed to be very still and very small. He had developed out of necessity the ability to read vibration the way other people read words. This was not Roy Stokes on a staircase. This was something else entirely. Outside, Officer Cal Decker had stopped hitting the bay door. Ethan heard the silence where the fist had been and understood instinctively that something had changed in the geography of the situation. Decker had stopped because Decker had heard it too. And whatever Cal Decker was feeling on the other side of that steel door right now, it was not confidence. Then the headlights came. Even through the frosted panels at the top of the bay door, Ethan could see them. Not one set, not 5. A wall of white light that moved down Ironwood Avenue in a formation so tight and deliberate that it looked from the inside of the garage like something geological. Like a glacier that had been moving in one direction for a very long time and had no particular interest in stopping. Boone Mercer was standing at the workbench with his back to the room. He had not moved, had not picked up a tool or a weapon or a phone. He just stood with his hands flat on the bench surface and waited, and the waiting itself was a kind of statement. Wade Flynn moved to the wall beside the bay door and stood there with his arms crossed. Dude had come back from the office with the space heater and set it near Ethan's crate, and then positioned himself near the rear door of the shop, not blocking it, just present. A very large, very quiet presence. The engines outside cut off in sequence, and the silence that replaced them was somehow louder than the noise had been. A single set of footsteps crossed the asphalt. Boone hit the button on the wall. The bay door rolled up. The man standing in the driveway was someone who commanded space without effort. He was 6 feet 3 inches tall, carrying the density of a man who had worked physically his entire life and never softened, with a black beard, gone gray at the edges, and eyes that processed the scene in front of him with complete efficiency. Behind him, filling the entire width of Ironwood Avenue, in a tight arc that curved around Cal Decker's patrol car like a fist closing around something, were 32 motorcycles. Their riders sat still on their machines. Every single one of them was looking at Cal Decker. Vance Holden, president of the Grayfall chapter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, walked into the garage and looked at Boone. Then he looked at Ethan. Then he walked back to the edge of the bay door and looked at Decker the way you look at something that has stopped being dangerous and started being inconvenient. Evening, Cal. Decker's jaw worked. His eyes moved across the arc of 32 riders and came back to Vance. This is police business, Holden. I am tracking a runaway juvenile in connection with a stolen property complaint. You are obstructing a law enforcement action. Vance tilted his head slightly. You file that complaint tonight, Decker said nothing. Funny thing about paperwork, Vance said. It creates a record. Records have timestamps. And when a complaint gets filed at 2 in the morning, the same night a 15-year-old boy ends up hypothermic in Boone's driveway with someone's belt print on his jaw, those timestamps start telling a story. He paused. You want to think carefully about what story yours is going to tell. Get off this property, Vance said. He said it the way you say things that are already decided, not a request, not a threat, an announcement of a fact that was going to be true regardless of anyone's preferences. Decker stood in the snow for 4 more seconds. Ethan counted them from inside the garage, and then Decker got in his car. He backed slowly out of the driveway, and the riders on either side of the street moved with a precision that suggested they had done this before opening a corridor just wide enough for the cruiser to pass through and closing behind it without a word being spoken. The taillights disappeared around the corner of Ironwood Avenue. Vance Holden turned around and walked back inside and looked at Ethan Cross sitting on his crate in Boone's oversized hoodie, and his expression shifted into something that was not warmth externally, but was the specific quality of attention the serious man gives to something he has decided is worth his time. You the kid with the phone, he said. Yes, sir, Vance looked at Boone. Show me. They gathered around the workbench. Boone laid the LG flip phone on a clean section of the surface and opened it and handed it to Vance. Wade stood to Vance's left. Duke had come forward from the back of the shop. Ethan stood slightly apart, close enough to see, but far enough to make clear he understood this was not his room. Vance scrolled through the photographs without speaking. He was methodical. He did not hurry. He looked at the photograph of the padlocked pantry for a long time before moving to the next one. He looked at the photograph of the refrigerator with the combination lock. He looked at the photograph of the thermostat in its plastic key lock housing. He looked at Ethan's bruised forearm with the belt mark on it, and then he looked at the bruise now visible on the left side of Ethan's jaw, and then he looked back at the photograph. He listened to the first audio recording. Judith Boone's car had not yet left the driveway when Ethan had started the recording, and the audio captured everything. The footsteps on the porch, the sound of paper exchanging hands, the scratch of the pen, Judith Boone's voice saying what it said professionally, warm completely without conscience. Vance listened to it once, then he played it again. He handed the phone to Wade, then he looked at Ethan. How many recordings are on there? 7 audio, 41 photographs. How long did this take you? 4 weeks to get the phone working, 3 weeks collecting. Vance was quiet for a moment. How old are you? 15. The words sat in the air of the garage for a beat. Then Vance said, Wade, call Arthur. I don't care what time it is. Arthur Slater arrived 40 minutes later in a dark green pickup truck that was older and more battered than you would expect from a man who had spent 12 years as a federal prosecutor before retiring into private practice. He was 61 years old, lean and angular, with close-cut silver hair and reading glasses he kept in his breast pocket, and put on with the precise deliberateness of someone who understands that the act of putting on glasses says something to the room. He carried a worn leather briefcase that he set on the workbench without ceremony. He shook Vance's hand. He nodded at Boone. He looked at Ethan with the focused, neutral assessment of a man who has interviewed witnesses for 30 years and can read a person's credibility in the first 90 seconds. He picked up the phone. I went through the photographs and the audio recordings in order, slowly stopping occasionally to play a recording a second time. He asked Ethan 3 questions during this process. The questions were specific and procedural, and Ethan answered each one accurately and without embellishment, giving times and dates and precise descriptive details in the flat, careful way of someone who has been organizing information in his head for weeks. Arthur asked his 3rd question, and Ethan answered it, and then Arthur was quiet for a long time. He took his reading glasses off and held them in one hand and looked at the phone on the bench. Then he said, this is not one house. Nobody spoke. Arthur looked up at Vance. Judith Boone's name appears on the intake paperwork for all 5 children currently in the Riggs placement. He set the glasses down. She processes placements for the entire county. If she is running a kickback arrangement with Dolores Riggs, there is no rational reason to believe Dolores Riggs is the only house she is running it with. He picked up the phone again and looked at the photographs. This evidence, combined with a financial audit of her county placement records and cross-referencing her approval signatures, could expose a network. He said network the way you say a word that is heavier than it looks. Not one house, multiple facilities. He looked at Ethan. Do you have anything else? Anything you remember that is not on this phone? Ethan thought for exactly 3 seconds. I have the license plates of 3 other social workers who came to the house while I was there. They all came on days that were not scheduled inspection days. They all left with something in their hand that they did not arrive with. Arthur looked at him steadily. I memorized the plates, Ethan said. I can give them to you right now. The silence in the garage had a particular texture to it. The silence of a room full of men recalibrating. Vance looked at Boone. Boone was looking at Ethan with an expression that had something unreadable in it, something that was not surprised but was in the neighborhood of recognition. Arthur Slater opened his briefcase and took out a legal pad and a pen. Go ahead, he said. Ethan recited all 3 license plates from memory, along with the dates and approximate times of each visit, physical descriptions of the individuals, and the specific details he had observed at the door during each departure. Spoke for 4 minutes without stopping or correcting himself. When he finished, Arthur had filled a page and a quarter. Arthur put the cap on his pen. He looked at Vance. This boy has been building a case for 7 weeks, Arthur said. More systematically than adult informants I have worked with in 30 years of practice. Vance looked at Ethan. You knew you were building a case. Ethan met his eyes. I knew nobody else was going to. The stove ticked in the corner. Outside, the wind moved down Ironwood Avenue. Nobody in the garage said anything for a moment. Then Vance Holden pulled a chair from the corner, set it down across from Ethan's crate, and sat in it with his elbows on his knees. Here's what happens next, he said. Arthur is going to spend the next 2 hours going through everything on that phone and everything you just gave him. He is going to build a package. That package goes to the FBI field office in Seattle and to the Washington State Bureau of Investigation. Not the county, not local law enforcement, state and federal only. He paused. Because Decker, Ethan said, because Decker, Vance confirmed, and because if Judith Boone has been running this arrangement for as long as we think she has people in county offices who will warn her the moment a local complaint is filed. We go directly to people they cannot reach. He looked at Ethan steadily. While Arthur does that, you are going to stay here in this shop where you are warm and where nobody can get to you. Duke and his wife Clara are going to come in. Clara is a registered nurse. She is going to look at your face and your wrist and document your injuries formally. That documentation gets added to Arthur's package. It becomes part of the official record. He paused again. Nothing that happened to you in that house is going to be invisible. You understand me? Ethan understood him. Sparks arrived at the shop at 4 a.m. His full name was Garrett Briggs, and he was 44 years old. Former Army Signal Corps, 8 years as a contractor for a defense technology firm before he came back to Grayfall and started patching exhaust pipes for a living, which he said he preferred. He had close-cropped gray hair in the quiet, competent manner of a man who solved problems by understanding them completely before touching anything. He set a laptop on the workbench and went to work on the 3 license plates Ethan had provided. Within 90 minutes, he had pulled county records, vehicle registration, data, payroll records from the State Department of Social Services and banking information from 2 public record databases that required a specific understanding of how public records requests work to navigate efficiently. He printed everything on a portable printer he had brought in a canvas bag. The stack of paper that came out of that printer was 47 pages. Sparks squared the edges against the workbench and set the stack in front of Arthur Slater without a word. Arthur put his reading glasses on and began working through it page by page using a red felt-tip pen to mark specific entries. The marks came steadily, one after another, line after line. Money moving from county accounts through shell designations into personal accounts. Judith Boone's name appearing on approval forms for placements that fed into facilities where the paperwork showed unusually high compliance ratings and unusually low expenditure records. A pattern that was, once you saw it, very difficult to explain as anything other than what it was. Arthur worked in silence for 40 minutes. Then he set the pen down and pressed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. 6 facilities, 3 counties, he said. The earliest transaction I can trace with confidence goes back 4 years. He looked at Vance. Judith Boone is not a participant in this network. She is the architect of it. The room absorbed this. Ethan was sitting on his crate with the space heater running at his feet and Clara Flynn sitting beside him on a folding chair. Clara was a compact, steady-handed woman with dark auburn hair who had arrived at the shop at 3:30 and introduced herself to Ethan with the calm professionalism of someone who has worked emergency rooms and does not alarm easily. She had examined his jaw and his wrist and the bruising along his ribs where Roy's belt had caught him 2 weeks ago and had not fully healed. She had photographed every injury under a proper light, measured and documented each one, and had written her findings in formal clinical notation on the letterhead of the Grayfall Medical Center, where she worked 3 days a week. When Arthur made his announcement about Judith Boone, Clara looked at Ethan and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything. But she put her hand briefly on top of his, and he did not pull away. 43 kids, Sparks said from the far end of the bench. Across all 6 facilities, that is my count from the placement records. Could be higher. The number sat in the room like something with weight. Vance stood. He looked at Arthur. How long to get the package to Seattle? Arthur was already reaching for his phone. He did not answer the question directly. Instead, he stepped to the far side of the garage and dialed a number and spoke quietly for 3 minutes. When he came back, his expression had shifted in a specific way, the way a man's face shifts when he has received confirmation of something he needed to be true. I called my contact at the FBI Seattle field office, he said. I have worked with this man for 15 years and he owes me a professional debt that I am collecting tonight. He has been briefed on the outline of what we have, and he has pre-authorization to mobilize. His team will leave Seattle at 4:30 in the morning. They will be in Grayfall by 7. He looked at Vance. The Washington State Bureau of Investigation will coordinate simultaneously. State troopers on the ground at the same time federal agents arrive. The county will know nothing until it is already done. He paused. But there is a condition. The operation executes at first light tomorrow. Not in 48 hours, tomorrow morning. Vance looked at Ethan. Ethan said what he had been sitting with since Arthur first outlined the plan. The inspection, he said. Judith Boone's next scheduled visit to the Riggs house is Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock. But that is not the real problem. He paused. There was a girl at the house when I arrived. Her name was Amanda. She was 11. 3 days after Judith came for her second visit that month, Amanda was gone. No warning, no explanation. Dolores just said she had been transferred. He looked at Arthur. If Judith Boone finds out something is coming, she will move the kids before anyone gets there. She has done it before. Rosie is 7 years old and she weighs 41 pounds, and she is still in that house on County Road 7 right now. We cannot wait. Arthur looked at him for a long moment. We are not waiting, he said. First light tomorrow. That is already the plan. Vance looked at Ethan with the particular focus of a man who has just finished recalibrating something. You started this, he said. The evidence you built in that house is what made tonight possible. He paused. Every one of those 43 kids across those 6 facilities. The reason any of this moves is because a 15-year-old boy spent 7 weeks in a freezing room building a case that nobody asked him to build. He stood up. You are going to be there when it ends. At 5:45 in the morning, 20 minutes before Arthur finished the complete package, Cal Decker came back. This time he had 2 other vehicles with him. Another Grayfall patrol car and a dark blue unmarked sedan that sat low on its springs the way vehicles sit when they are carrying weight. They pulled up at the entrance to Ironwood Avenue and stopped there, engines running, headlights on. Decker did not approach the garage, but he got out of his car and stood in the headlights, and the message was plain enough. He was still there. He was still watching. And the specific formation of the 3 vehicles, the way the unmarked sedan was positioned between the 2 patrol cars, suggested that tonight's arrangement had a different character than in the first visit. Inside the garage, Sparks had a camera feed from the security unit above the bay door on his laptop screen. He watched the 3 vehicles without expression. Decker brought company, he said. Vance looked at the screen. Then he looked at Arthur. Arthur picked up his phone again. He made a call that lasted 90 seconds. When he hung up, he looked at the screen. His Seattle contact had already been briefed on Decker's name and badge number as part of the initial call. What Arthur had just done was add a formal notation to the federal case file that Decker was currently attempting to obstruct an active federal witness. That notation had a timestamp. That timestamp would matter later. Give him 8 minutes, Arthur said. It took 6. The unmarked Sedan's lights went off first. Then it reversed back up Ironwood Avenue and turned onto the cross street and was gone. The second patrol car followed. Decker stood outside his cruiser for another 30 seconds, and even on the small laptop screen, the quality of his stillness had changed from threatening to something that had no threat left in it at all. He got in his car and drove away. Arthur Slater capped his red pen and looked at the stack of documents in front of him. Let us talk about the morning, he said. Vance assigning positions with the efficiency of a man who has done operational planning before and takes it seriously. Wade and 4 riders would be on the rig's property perimeter from first light position to ensure no vehicle left with children aboard before the federal and state teams arrived. Duke would stay with Ethan and Clara until confirmation came that the state was on site. Then Ethan would ride with Boone. You are going to be there when it ends, Vance said again. He said it the way he said things that were already decided. Clara looked at Ethan after Vance finished speaking. She said it simply and without performance. We have a room with a real bed and a door that locks from the inside. You can stay as long as you need to. Ethan looked at the floor. He nodded because his voice was not reliable at that particular moment. In the quiet that followed, Boone came to stand near the crate. He did not sit down. He stood with his arms at his sides and looked at the floor between his boots. For a moment, the way a man looks at something he has been carrying for a long time and is deciding whether to set down. There is something I want to tell you, he said. Not tonight. Tonight you sleep and you let Clara make sure you are all right. But in the morning before we ride, I want to tell you about the tattoo. Ethan looked up at him. Boone met his eyes. You are not the first kid I have seen wearing that bird, he said. He said it quietly without elaboration, and then he walked back to the workbench and picked up the socket wrench he had set down 2 hours ago. Ethan Cross sat with that sentence for a long time, turning it over, until Clara handed him a glass of water and 2 ibuprofen and told him to drink all of it, in the warmth of the stove, and the exhaustion of the night finally pulled him under. He slept on the cot Duke brought out from the back office with Boone's hoodie as a blanket in a garage on Ironwood Avenue, while outside the snow stopped in falling, and the temperature began very slowly to rise. The road south out of Grayfall ran along the river for 3 miles before it turned inland and climbed through second-growth timber toward the flat agricultural land where the old farms sat. In summer, the river was visible through the trees green and fast over gray rock. In November, it was invisible, just a sound below the embankment, cold water moving in the dark under a skin of new ice at the edges. Ethan sat behind Boone Mercer on the Harley and felt the engine through his whole body. Not just through his hands or his seat, but through his sternum, through his back teeth, through the place behind his ribs, where he had been carrying a hard, cold weight for 7 weeks. The weight did not go away, but the vibration of the engine was something to set against it, and that was enough for now. He had never been on a motorcycle before. He did not look back at Grayfall as they left it. He looked forward at the road, at the gray pre-dawn light coming up over the tree line, at the tail lights of the bikes ahead of them and the headlights of the bikes behind. 40 machines moving in formation through the early morning dark, their exhaust rising in synchronized columns that disappeared into the cold air above the tree canopy. Vance was at the front of the column on his black street glide. Wade was directly behind him, and then Boone and Ethan, then Duke, then the rest 2 abreast, filling the road completely from shoulder to shoulder in a way that left no question about what this procession was and where it was going. They did not use sirens. They did not need to. The sound of 40 Harleys on an empty county road at first light was its own announcement. They turned on to County Road 7 at 6:22 in the morning. Dolores Riggs heard them before she saw them. She was in the kitchen in her bathrobe filling the coffee maker with water from the tap when the vibration reached the house. It came up through the linoleum floor and into the soles of her slippers, and she stood very still with the water running and thought it was a truck on the highway. But it did not pass. It grew, and then it stopped, and then there was a silence that was worse than the sound had been. She moved to the kitchen window and wiped the condensation from the glass with the back of her hand. The gravel driveway and the road beyond, and the field on the far side of the fence, were filled with motorcycles. They were parked in a line that ran from the gate of the property back along the road as far as she could see in the gray morning light. The riders had not dismounted. They sat on their machines and looked at the house and said nothing. The coffee mug slipped from her fingers and shattered on the linoleum floor. She walked to the foot of the stairs and called Roy Stokes. Roy came down in his boots and his undershirt, still pulling his belt through the loops. He looked out the front door window and stopped moving. He stood there with the belt half threaded through the loops and looked at the line of motorcycles and the riders looking back at him. He did not finish threading the belt through the loops. Dolores had her phone in her hand and was dialing Cal Decker's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She dialed again. Voicemail again. She stood in the kitchen with the phone pressed against her ear and listened to his recorded voice and felt something she had not felt in 4 years of running this operation. She felt completely alone. The 3 dark SUVs arrived at 6:31. They came from the direction of the highway, and they pulled through the gate of the Riggs property and up the gravel driveway with the deliberate unhurriedness of vehicles that are not in a hurry because they do not need to be. Behind them came 2 Washington State Police cruisers, their light bars running blue and white, casting moving color across the snow-covered gravel. The SUVs parked in a line in front of the house. 6 agents in dark jackets got out of the first 2 vehicles. 2 more came from the third SUV, and these 2 walked differently from the others, with the bearing of people who operate at a higher level and are present to observe and confirm rather than to execute. Arthur Slater got out of the passenger seat of the lead SUV. He straightened his coat and looked at the house, and then at Vance Holden, who had dismounted and was standing at the edge of the driveway. Vance nodded once. Arthur walked to the front door of the house and knocked. When Dolores opened the door, she was still in her bathrobe. She looked at Arthur and then passed him at the agents in the state troopers, in the 40 motorcycles along the road and the riders sitting on them like a wall of dark stone. Arthur said her full name. He said it the way you say something that is not a greeting, but a formal declaration, the beginning of a process that has already been set in motion and will proceed regardless of anything she does from this point forward. He told her that agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation and officers from the Washington State Bureau of Investigation were present to execute a search of the premises and to take temporary emergency custody of the children in her care. Han told her she had the right to remain silent. Dolores looked at the document in Arthur's hand. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the line of motorcycles and the riders who had not moved and were not going to move, and something went out of her face. Not just the practiced warmth of the official smile, the specific quality of a person who has been operating for a long time on the assumption that no one is paying sufficient attention and has just discovered with total finality that they were wrong. She stepped back from the door. Roy Stokes tried to leave through the back. He had the door open and 1 foot on the back step when he found Wade Flynn and 2 other riders standing in the snow behind the house. They were not blocking the door exactly. They were just there, 3 men in leather vests, standing in the yard with their arms at their sides, looking at him with the patient, completely neutral expressions of people who have made a decision and are not reconsidering it. Roy looked at them. He looked at the belt that was still hanging from his left hand. He looked back at Wade. Wade said nothing. He did not need to. Roy Stokes stepped back inside and sat down at the kitchen table and put his hands flat on the surface. 2 state troopers came through the back door 30 seconds later, and Roy did not look at them or speak to them. He just sat there with his hands on the table and looked at the wall. One of the troopers took the belt from his hand without asking. The children were on the 2nd floor. The first agent up the stairs moved through the hallway with the careful, measured pace of someone entering a space where loud movement would cause harm. She knocked on the first door, then opened it. Marcus was awake. He was 12 years old, and he had been awake since the sound of the motorcycles reached the house, sitting on his cot, fully dressed with his shoes on. She told him her name. She told him she was with the FBI. She told him he was safe and that he was going to leave the house today and not come back. She said it quietly, and she said it once. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the small backpack beside his cot, which was already packed, and stood up. The second door was locked from the outside. A hasp and padlock the same configuration as the pantry downstairs. A trooper came up with bolt cutters. Behind the second door were two children, a 10-year-old boy named Tyler and a 9-year-old girl named June sitting on the floor against the far wall with a single blanket pulled over both of them. The room was cold enough that their breath showed. The window had been boarded over with plywood nailed from the outside. The agent sat down on the floor in front of them and did not stand up again or try to move them until Tyler reached out and touched her sleeve, checking the way a child checks a surface before trusting weight to it. She put her hand over his. They stood up. Rosie was in the last room on the left. Ethan was not supposed to go upstairs. He understood this, and he had agreed to it, and he had waited in the driveway with Boone for 11 minutes while the agents moved through the house. Then he heard a sound from the second floor window, faint through the glass and the cold air, a sound he recognized from 7 weeks of living in the same building. Small and thin and without specific content, not a word or a name, just a noise that a child makes when they have been frightened for so long that fear has become the air they breathe, and even the sound of rescue is indistinguishable from the sound of threat. I was at the front door before he had made a conscious decision to move. Boone did not stop him. He put one hand briefly on Ethan's shoulder as he passed and said nothing. He just let him go. Ethan went up the stairs and down the hallway to the last door on the left. The door was open. The agent was crouched in the doorway speaking in a low voice to someone inside who was not responding. Ethan looked past the agent. Rosie was under the cot. She had pulled the thin blanket with her, and she was pressed against the wall in the space between the cot frame and the baseboard. Her knees drawn up and her face turned away, her pale blonde hair covering the side of her face. She was wearing the same clothes she had been wearing 2 nights ago. She was very small in the thin morning light coming through the cracked window. The agent looked back at Ethan. She assessed him in a second and moved sideways to give him the doorway. Ethan sat down on the floor outside the door. He did not go into the room. He sat in the hallway with his back against the doorframe and his knees up the same position Rosie was in on the other side of the wall, as if the wall between them were simply an irrelevance. He said her name once, quietly. Silence. He did not say anything else for a while. He sat and he waited and he listened to the sounds of the house below him, the careful movement of agents and troopers, the low voices, the specific quality of a building being taken apart from the inside and something different being built in the space it was leaving. After a while, he said, "The padlock on the pantry downstairs is gone. I watched them take it off." Silence from under the cot. "The refrigerator, too," he said. "The lock is gone. There is food in there, real food. Nobody's going to take it away from you." He stopped. He looked at the cracked window and the pale gray light coming through it and thought about what he had needed to hear. 7 weeks ago, standing in a hallway watching a car drive away down a gravel road, and he said that. "Nobody is getting paid to bring you back here," he said. "It stopped working like that about an hour ago." There was a long pause. Then a small voice came from under the cot. "Is Roy outside?" "No." "Is Dolores?" "No. They are both with the police. They are not coming back." Another pause. "How do you know?" "Because I made sure," Ethan said. He said it with the flatness of someone stating a fact about the physical world. "I made sure before I left. That is where I was. That is what I was doing." He heard movement under the cot, the scrape of a small body on the floor. Rosie came out from under the cot with her blanket around her shoulders and stood up and looked at Ethan sitting in the doorway. She looked at him the way she had been looking at things for 4 months sideways, from an angle checking it from a direction that made it easier to look away quickly if she needed to. He did not stand up. He stayed where he was on the floor so she was taller than him. She looked at him for a moment. Then she walked to the doorway and sat down next to him on the floor. She did not say anything. She just pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders and sat there beside him in the hallway, in the gray morning light, and Ethan Cross sat with her, and neither of them needed to say anything at all. Below them in the house that was no longer what it had been, the sound of careful hands doing careful work continued. Cal Decker arrived at the Riggs property at 7:14. He came alone in his patrol car, and he pulled up to the gate and got out and stood looking at the federal SUVs and the state cruisers and the 40 motorcycles and the agents moving in and out of the house. He stood there processing all of it, and then he straightened up and came through the gate with the practiced authority of a man who believes that forward movement creates legitimacy. He crossed the yard and came directly toward Ethan, who was standing near the porch with Boone. Decker's hand came up, palm out, pointing at Ethan. "That kid is carrying stolen property," he said to the nearest agent. "He has a phone taken from the Riggs residence. I need to take him in for questioning." Boone stepped between Decker and Ethan without a word. He did not reach for anything. He did not raise his hands or change his expression. He simply occupied the space between them, and the size of him made the geometry of the situation perfectly clear. Decker looked at Boone, then he looked past him at Ethan. Arthur Slater came around the side of the lead SUV and walked toward them at a pace that was unhurried and entirely deliberate, the way a man walks when he wants you to watch him coming. He stopped 6 feet from Decker. "The property in question," Arthur said, "was submitted to federal custody at 6:04 this morning." He reached into his breast pocket and produced a document folded once. "We have the chain of custody receipt." He held it at a readable angle. "The phone, along with 47 pages of supporting financial documentation and a signed medical report, is currently in the possession of the Federal Bureau of Investigation as material evidence in an active federal corruption case." He paused. "Officer Decker, your name appears in that case file. You have appeared twice in the vicinity of the federal witness in the past 5 hours in ways that have been formally documented and time-stamped." He put the document back in his pocket. "Two agents from the Seattle field office would like to speak with you. Right now." Decker looked for an angle. He looked at the motorcycles along the road. He looked at the agents standing near the SUVs who were looking back at him with the specific expression of people who have been waiting for exactly this moment. He looked at Boone, who had not moved. The angle was not there. One of the FBI agents came forward and said Decker's full name and badge number and began speaking in the formal, unhurried cadence of someone reading from a document they have memorized. The charges were 4 in number. The agent, all 4. Decker looked past him at Vance Holden, who was leaning against his motorcycle 20 feet away, arms crossed, watching. Vance said nothing. He did not need to. Decker took his badge off his belt and held it for a moment. Then he set it on the hood of the nearest state police cruiser and put his hands behind his back and waited for what came next. Judith Boone did not make them come to find her. At 7:23 in the morning, while federal agents were photographing the padlocked pantry and the plywood-covered window, and the combination lock from the refrigerator, Judith Boone drove her gray Honda Civic to the parking lot of the County Department of Social Services on Elm Street and parked in her assigned space and turned off the engine. She sat in the car for a while. Then she called the county administrator's direct line and said she needed to speak with someone from the federal office. She said she was at the DSS building. She said she would wait. The agents arrived in 11 minutes. When they got there, she was still in the car, her hands in her lap, looking at the front entrance of the building she had worked in for 9 years. One of the agents opened the car door for her and she got out, and as she did, she looked at the building the way a person looks at something they are seeing for the last time, not with grief exactly, but with the particular attention of a closing. She said nothing until she was in the back seat of the federal vehicle. Then she said, "I knew this day was coming." She said it to no one specifically, and she said it in the flat, unhurried voice of someone for whom a certain truth has existed for a long time, quietly and without drama, waiting for the moment it stopped being private. It was the most honest thing she had said in 4 years. The sentencing came 4 months later in a federal courtroom in Seattle on a gray February morning with rain running down the tall windows and the gallery full of people who had driven a long way to be there. Dolores Riggs received 14 years. Roy Stokes received 11 with no possibility of parole for the first 7. Cal Decker received 8 years in a federal correctional facility, along with permanent revocation of his law enforcement certification and a lifetime bar on any public safety employment in the state of Washington. Judith Boone received 19 years. Arthur Slater had argued for the Boone sentence specifically and at length on the grounds that she was not a participant in a criminal enterprise, but its creator, its administrator, its reason for existing at all. The judge had agreed. The 19 years reflected not just what she had done, but what she had made possible, which was the systematic exploitation of 43 children across 6 facilities over 4 years. Every one of them processed through her office, approved by her signature, funded by her arrangement. 43 children, 6 facilities, 4 years. Arthur had testified before a state legislative committee in February, 1 week before the sentencing. He had brought Ethan's signed statement with him and had read from it for 4 minutes while the committee listened in complete silence. He had not used Ethan's name. Ethan was 15 years old and his identity was protected under state juvenile witness statutes. But the words were his, every precise, careful, documented word of them. The state legislature began overhauling the county foster system oversight protocols in January before the sentencing, because the evidence Arthur had submitted to the committee in December was specific enough and damning enough that waiting felt unconscionable to the 3 committee members who had read it over the holiday recess and arrived in January pale and purposeful. The new protocols included independent inspection authority, mandatory financial auditing of placement facilities, and a requirement that social workers be assigned to facilities by rotation rather than by permanent caseload, which was the structural vulnerability that Judith Boone had exploited from the beginning. Marcus was in a new placement in Spokane with a family his school counselor had matched him to, and Arthur received word that he was doing well. Tyler and June were with a foster family in Olympia. Rosie was placed with a family in Gray Fall, 4 blocks from Ironwood Avenue, and she was gaining weight and she had started speaking in full sentences again, which she had stopped doing sometime in the first 2 months at the Riggs house, and which was coming back slowly the way things come back that have not been lost but only hidden. Ethan Cross was living with Duke and Clara Flynn. He had been there since the morning of the raid, and in the weeks that followed, the house on Maple Street became the first place in 15 years that Ethan Cross woke up in the morning and did not spend the first 30 seconds of consciousness assessing for threat. Duke had removed the pantry lock before Ethan arrived, dropping it in the trash without ceremony. Ethan had discovered this on his first night testing the pantry door with the reflexive caution of someone who has been conditioning themselves against locked doors for 7 weeks. The door opened. He stood in front of the open pantry for a long time, not taking anything. Just standing there with the door open in the dark, understanding that the door would open again tomorrow. And the day after that, and the day after that. I went to bed. On the 9th night, Clara had left a plate of food on the counter with a note under the edge of it that said, "Only help yourself. There is more in the fridge." On the 10th night, he helped himself. He enrolled at Gray Fall High School in December, and by February, he had straight A's in all 5 classes, which was not surprising to Clara, who had watched him read everything in the house within the first 3 weeks of his arrival and had quietly restocked the bookshelf twice. His English teacher stopped him after class in January to ask if he had ever considered writing as a vocation. He told her he would think about it. He was thinking about it. On a Saturday afternoon in early June, the bay doors of Boone Mercer's garage on Ironwood Avenue were rolled open all the way for the first time since winter. The smell came out onto the street in a warm wave, charcoal and hickory from the barrel smoker Duke had set up in the parking area. Motor oil and metal and the particular smell of hot rubber that means someone has been doing something productive with an engine. The classic rock from the shop stereo was loud enough to reach the end of the block. Ethan Cross was standing at the Snap-on toolbox. I had put on 18 pounds since November clean weight from regular meals, eaten without anxiety at a table where nobody watched his plate and nobody reached for his food. The swelling in his jaw had resolved completely within 2 weeks of the raid, leaving no permanent mark. The bruising on his forearm had faded to nothing by December. He was not the boy who had crawled across that driveway in the sleet. He looked like himself. He was beginning to understand what that meant. He had been coming to the garage on Saturday morning since February when Boone had looked up one afternoon from a carburetor and found Ethan standing in the bay door and had not asked any questions, just pointed at the rolling stool and handed him a wrench. They had been working together every Saturday since. Ethan had discovered somewhere in those hours that he understood engines the way he understood numbers, intuitively, structurally, as systems with internal logic that rewarded attention and patience. Boone had noticed this without commenting on it, which was itself a form of comment that Ethan had come to understand. Vance Holden came through the open bay door from the parking area with a bottle of Coca-Cola in each hand and handed one to Ethan and looked at him the way Vance looked at things he considered settled. "Straight A's," he said. "Good." Then he went back outside to argue with Wade about a carburetor. Duke came in from the smoker with a paper plate in each hand and set them on the workbench. Clara came in behind him, and her expression did the thing. It sometimes did the thing Ethan had learned to receive without deflecting, which was that it became very direct and very warm at the same time and stayed there for a moment before returning to its usual steadiness. She handed him a fork. Eat something, she said. He ate something. Boone set down the socket wrench he had been using and wiped his hands on a shop rag and looked at the clock on the wall. Then he looked at the metal locker against the far wall and walked to it. He opened the locker and stood there for a moment with his back to the room. Then he turned around. He was holding a leather vest, black full grain, cut to a size that was not Boone's size but was close to Ethan's. The leather had been oiled and broken and not new, but not old, the quality of something prepared with care over a period of time. There was no death's head patch on the back. That patch was earned over years and by specific process and in specific company, and it was not a thing given lightly or early, and everyone in the building understood this without it needing to be said. But on the left breast of the vest, in the position where a designation would go, was a small piece of dark leather stitched to the facing by hand. On it, in careful embroidered letters, were 5 words, Grayfall HAMC, and below it on a separate line, family. Boone walked back across the garage and held the vest out to Ethan. Ethan looked at it, he took it, and put it on. It fit the way something fits when it has been made with a specific person in mind. Boone looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the workbench and then back at Ethan, and something settled in his face that had been unresolved since November, since the night he had shown a flashlight on a boy's wrist in a frozen driveway and seen something he had not expected to see again in this lifetime. He pushed his right sleeve up to the elbow without saying anything. The penguin was there on his wrist, small and uneven, and 35 years old. The lines faded to a soft blue-gray, the proportions slightly wrong in the way of something made by a young hand working without a guide. Ethan pushed his own left sleeve up. His was darker, newer, the lines still sharp, the same slightly wrong proportions. They stood with their wrists parallel for a moment, not touching, just visible. The 2 birds side by side, one old and one new, made the same way for the same reason 35 years apart. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Boone said his name was Danny Carver. He was 13 years old and he made mine first, and then I made his. It took us 2 nights because we ran out of ink in the first pen and had to find another one. He looked at the bird on his wrist. We used to say it meant you could find your way home even when you did not know where home was. He paused. We made that up. We were 13 years old and we were scared and we needed to believe in something. So we invented what the bird meant and said it to each other enough times that it started to be true. He was quiet for a moment. Danny died when he was 19. Motorcycle accident on Route 2, February, black ice. He did not have anyone at his funeral except me. He looked up at Ethan. I built this shop on this corner because this corner is the one place in Grayfall where nobody ever told me I did not belong. He stopped. Took me about 20 years to understand that was what home felt like. That the belonging was the thing, not the building. He looked at the vest on Ethan's shoulders. You knocked on the right door, kid, he said. Ethan Cross looked at the 2 birds on their parallel wrists. He looked at the 5 words stitched into the leather on his chest. I thought about a Tuesday in October when a woman in a gray Civic had driven him down a gravel road to a house where the pantry was locked and the thermostat was inaccessible, and the sound of footsteps on stairs meant something specific and bad. He thought about 7 weeks of lying on a cot in the dark, counting what he had, building something from nothing, working alone on a case nobody had asked him to build, in a language nobody had taught him to speak. I thought about 43 children across 6 facilities who were somewhere better tonight because of a cracked LG flip phone and 11 days of patience and 12 minutes per week in an alley behind a dry cleaner on the north end of Grayfall. He thought about Rosie 4 blocks away, learning to speak in full sentences again. He thought about what Boone had said, that they had made up what the bird meant and said it enough times that it became true. I thought that was not a bad way to make something true. The afternoon light moved across the garage floor in a long yellow rectangle, and the smoker sent its hickory smell across the lot, and the radio was playing something Ethan did not know the name of, but thought he would like to know. Wade and Vance were arguing companionably about the carburetor. Clara was telling Duke he was standing too close to the smoker again. Sparks was under a truck in the far bay talking to the engine. Arthur Slater had texted that morning. The Senate committee had voted to approve the new foster care oversight legislation. 14-1. Ethan should know. Ethan had read the text 4 times. He was not a case number, not a runaway, not a ward of the county or a bounty to be collected or a name on a form in the back seat of a gray Civic. He pushed his sleeve back down over the bird on his wrist. He picked up his fork and finished what Clara had brought him. He set the plate down and turned back to the workbench and picked up the 3/8 socket wrench and looked at Boone. Boone had already turned back to the engine block. Ready, Ethan said. Boone held out his hand for the wrench without looking up. Ethan put it in his hand. Well, outside on Ironwood Avenue, the June afternoon was warm and the snow was 5 months gone, and the street was dry pavement in the sunlight, and in a garage on the corner where a boy had once crawled out of the cold and into the light, 2 men who had been looking for home for 35 years and 15 years respectively were working on an engine together, and neither of them needed to say anything about it because some things do not require saying. They are just true.